live on Facebook. You're good to go.
Hey, what's going on, WBSC? Tonight we're live. I got Tyler West and Robert Diana of WhiskeyNetwork.net, and myself, of course, the Cadden. How's everybody going? Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce David Vitale of Starward Australian Whisky. I've been drinking whiskey for a long, long time, and this is my first go with an Australian whiskey. I don't think I've lived enough. Now I have. Dave, welcome to WBSA.
Thanks, Chad. It's really exciting to be here. It's kind of funny. We've been in market for about 12 months now. I moved the family over to the Pacific Northwest in March of last year. And, that comment that, I thought I kind of drank a lot of whiskey and, I had a broad kind of palate but this surprised me is still the case. I've got a lot of work to do to kind of build awareness for the category.
Yeah, it's definitely a category that's not really high on the shelf, so to speak. So let's get started on a couple questions I got for you. You started your career in Australian whiskey world in Tasmania, and then you founded your own distillery, Starward. Are there any similarities between Tasmania and Melbourne that drew you there?
So the whiskey making kind of history of Australia dates back to the late 19th century, and most of it was actually Melbourne, my hometown, where Starward is. But in the mid 80s, I think as there was a bit of a global downturn and tariffs were reduced, the competitiveness of the local market wasn't that great. So that industry was mothballed. And when it was reborn, it was actually reborn in Tasmania. And it'd be fair to say that sort of industry was fairly focused on single malt whiskey and fairly focused on, looking at time-honored traditions to create the whiskeys that they were producing, but with a modern slant or a local slant, be it with the malted barley that they were using or the barrels that they were sourcing. So by the time I started, I knew we could make great whiskey. Really, for me, it was like, well, if we're going to be in the sharing cabinet alongside Scotch, bourbon, Irish, Japanese now, right? What is it that sets us apart? Like, we can't be a modern take on a tradition. We needed to be our own distinctive style. And fortunately for us, within a day's drive of the distillery, we've got amazing malted barley, we've got amazing wheat, and we've also got amazing red wine barrels, which is what we use to age the whiskey. So
leads me a little bit into my next question. I'm jumping the gun a little bit. What characterizes Australian whiskey as far as its own unique take on whiskey?
Yeah, I think it's the aging process. We're like, if you think of how much flavor is imparted by the oak, like in bourbons and scotches, then it has to be the wood policy. And there's so much more to it. Like, we take a lot of care in sourcing the malted barley that we're using. It's a brewing spec, and we ferment it like a beer. But really, fundamentally, if you think about the Australian style and what makes it different, it is really boiled down to the wood policy and these amazing red wine barrels that we use to age the whiskey.
Okay. So your whiskey is aged in red wine barrels. Do you have any plans to mature or even finish your whiskey in any other type of barrels?
When we first started, we had this amazing White Dog, the new make spirit that comes off the still that we were really kind of proud of. It's delicious. You can drink it straight off the still. It's almost like a barley schnapps as opposed to this hot white lightning, and we felt like actually bourbon barrels would be a great foil for this spirit, like to make it shine through. But coming back to this kind of notion of like, well, you know what, there's probably a fair few single malt whiskies matured in bourbon barrels that you're going to reach for in the sharing cabinet before you would before you would ours. Let's think about what could be really compelling, and that's why we chose wine barrels. And I'd say about 95% of the whiskey that we have in bond is matured in wine barrels, and then we've got some interesting barrels that we use to either finish the whiskey in or do the full maturation in, of which a lot of them are Wild Turkey and Maker's Mark barrels, my two favorite bourbons. So
right now, makers.
there you go. Yeah, it's kind of like, I think it's
opening up before we taste your whiskey later on.
Yeah, and so we love to play with finishes. We just released the ginger beer cask finished whiskey, which is aged in fortified wine barrels for about 4 years, and then we disgorge the contents of the barrels and then finish some ginger beer, actually ferment some ginger beer in the barrel, and then empty the ginger beer out, which is spiked. It's like 11% ginger beer, and then after that we put the fortified wine matured whiskey back in for another 9 months. We can't keep up. Like this batch was 1,400 bottles and it sells out within hours. So nice. We love to have fun with just pushing the boundaries of what whiskey can be.
Well, that's how everything should be, shouldn't it? I mean,
yeah.
If you don't push your boundaries, you never know where your limits are.
Yeah.
So you're a relatively new distillery. The market for craft whiskey is kind of a tough one. What's been your biggest challenge towards brand recognition here of Starward over here in the U.S.?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if you've got 30 feet of shelf space, about 27 of it's going to be bourbon, right? American whiskey. And then you got 3 feet for Scotch, Irish, Canadian, and now this new category of world whiskeys, of which we're one, right? So it's a pretty tight space to kind of stand out in. I think the interesting thing for me has been that actually there's a huge curiosity about world whiskey generally, new world whiskey generally. Gotcha. And so more and more people are going to that section of the aisle. And fortunately for us, we've won some awards that kind of really give people some comfort that they're buying something that's value for money. And we've been pretty given.
What were some of the awards?
We've won best in class at San Francisco Spirits Competition. That's kind of double gold, top of the class. That's on that in craft whiskey, and we've picked up a couple of awards for both of the whiskeys at the World Whiskey Awards. So, they're great whiskeys. 91 points in Whiskey Advocate. And other journals as well. So, it's one of those things where, look, we don't get out of bed to win awards, but they certainly help kind of at least give people some comfort that
everybody likes
buying. What they're buying it shouldn't disappoint. And, so that's been helpful. I think also the exchange rate, at the moment you can take $10 US and basically buy a house in Australia. So like having the ability to have a sharp price point, twofold, the double grain whiskeys are around about $30 to $35 and you get change out of 50 for Nova. So for a world whiskey, that kind of is quite competitively priced too. So, there's been some things that we've done, we've tried to capture the curiosity of people with this idea that whiskey comes from Australia, and then, following on from that, build this idea that, you can age whiskey in wine barrels and it's delicious, and actually you can give it a go. It's quite affordable.
Right on. So have you thought about any special styles of whiskey that your distillery would like to play with in the future, such as like a higher corn content or a rye based?
I'm a sucker for a good rye whiskey. So I would love to do that. The challenge we have with rye is obviously the processing of it is far more complicated than it is, say, with the single malt, which is, effectively just a little microbrewery that you then attach a still on the end of. Rye, you got to cook it. It's quite, complicated. And the technology that we have in terms of distillation is really built around batch pot distillation as opposed to the other styles. So I would love to do a rye. We can get some malted rye, which is still tricky, but that's probably something we'd love to do. And a great Australian distillery in Sydney actually just picked up best rye whiskey in the world. It's called Archie Rose. You can't get it in the States. That's why I'm talking about it. No, they're great mates of mine. And You know what? It's interesting. Like, I'd be proud to take the keys of any Australian distillery. I mean that genuinely. Like, we're all making amazing whiskies. We all stand for something different, but the quality of all of our whiskies, very, very, very high. And I'm just frustrated there aren't more of them here to, as to your point, to kind of create more space on the shelf to say, hey, this is quite interesting. There's
Right.
more than one. There's a few, and they're all bloody good. Yeah.
Well, the beautiful thing about right now is you're in front of almost 40,000 enthusiasts, people that just love the whiskeys, just everything about it. I mean, from the fields to the bottles to the glasses sitting around the table. I mean, that's the beautiful thing of something like this. To go on to my next question, lost where I was at for a second. I got thinking about all the funness in whiskey. And my God, it's a beautiful thing. So one of the biggest questions for younger distillers and distilleries is, do you want to age your whiskey longer? And I think that's kind of a, without a doubt, point. But with your whiskey, what do you think is a appropriate level? I mean,
Yeah, there's a sweet spot, right? Like, I mean, it's a really interesting question. Now, one of the things about, we know that Kentucky ages whiskey really differently to Scotland or Ireland, and that's going to be different to Canada, which is different to Japan, right? And so it follows reason that Australia has a really interesting and very different climate to mature whiskey. And Melbourne is famed actually for having 4 seasons in a day. And, people kind of say that about everywhere, but we literally can have during the summer days that exceed 110 Fahrenheit, and then in the evenings it drops down to 65, and then back up to 105 the next day, and then down. So the diurnal range changes quite dramatically. So it's not tropical like rum or Taiwanese whiskey where it's just hot all the time. It's not frigid like in Scotland where the barrels are just effectively resting. It's not seasonal like Kentucky. It's just always changing. And so what that means is that we've got really hardworking barrels that we've got to keep an eye on, all the time. So for us, 3 to 4 years is kind of our sweet spot. We can stretch that to say 6, but even barrel 1, which is like giving birth to a child as a founder, right? That's out of wood. It's not like we're keeping that for prosperity. We haven't bottled it yet. We just put it in glass to keep it inert and stable. But any longer, and it just would have started to go downhill. So, for us, 3 to 4 years is the sweet spot, and then after about 6, there's we're going to have some complexity with the character of the whiskey. It's just going to be over extracted and not as great as it would be younger. So that's a factor of our climate, and it means that a Melbourne year is really, really different to anywhere else, and that's how we kind of come up with the phrase matured for 3 Melbourne years.
Right. I like that. I love all the little catchphrases and little things that you see on the bottles or on the back labels and whatnot. Given that Nova and Solera are both single malts, can you explain the difference between the two of them?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, we kind of stand for our ethos is Australian whiskey aged in Australian wine barrels. That's all we do. Nova is table wine, red wine, big Aussie reds like Shiraz, Cabernet, and Pinot, typically. We get those barrels straight from the winery to the distillery. Wine goes out, whiskey goes in, no charring, recoupering, or anything of the barrel. So, you get a lot of freshness and brightness to the whiskey because of that. Solera is a fortified wine, most like sherry, but obviously sherry comes from Spain. This is local fortified wine made in that sort of sherry style. So it's a bit sweeter. And, I often think with particularly single malt whiskies, when there's sherry wine finished, you're getting a lot more of that Christmassy, fruit mince characteristics coming through. For us, it's a bit more brighter. It's a bit more caramel, toffee, candied orange, peaches, some stone fruit in there, but and banana. So it's quite complex and bold and rich Solera, whereas Nova still has that complexity, but a bit more approachable, and it has a dryness to it. You know, it's not as sweet. It has perceived sweetness on the nose with fruit, but on you know, when you're drinking it, it's a little drier than Solera.
Okay, cool. So we just had a question come in. It was kind of an interesting one regarding Australian whiskey in a whole. Do you foresee different styles coming from different areas?
Yeah, it's a good question. So,
Tasmania, Melbourne, I believe you have roughly 288 distilleries throughout Australia in a whole.
that's right. So, and in fact, on Tasmania, there are more, you know, more whiskey distilleries than there are on the island of Isla. You know, like, so it's quite, you know, it could potentially create a region of itself. But you know, even in Tasmania, you've got rye whiskey, you've got single malt whiskey, you've got someone making a corn-based mash, and that's kind of prevalent across all of the territories. I think that there's a huge opportunity in time. Each of our states has all of that diversity, but I think there's a huge opportunity over time for the wine characteristics to kind of travel through the whiskey in a way, and that you're getting a little bit of that nuance of local wineries in the whiskey itself. And I need to point out, you don't have to like Australian wine to like Australian whiskey, right? Like, it's not sort of like that link, but those characteristics are definitely there, that fruity berryness, some chocolate and spice. Yeah, so I'm not sure, to be honest. I think there's just a broad, diverse world. As I said, there's a single malt whiskey distillery and a rye distillery in pretty much every state now. So it's not really down to whiskey styles as we know it, but and it's still very young, you know, what, 20 or 25 odd years old. So we've got a lot to learn and a lot to kind of develop.
A lot to drink.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that. So being a newer distillery, solar system sounds like it's pretty expensive, kind of low. Why try something like that for being a newer distillery?
Yeah. So particularly with Solera, also we're using barrels that are those are actually recoopered, shaved, toasted, and recharred, but also resized. And the cost of making a 26-gallon barrel is the same as it is for a 50-gallon barrel, right? So all of a sudden we've got this kind of way more expensive per liter of alcohol barrel that we're using. We love the Solera barrels and the system because it provides us with a depth and complexity that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get for a whiskey of this age. So volume to surface area is one aspect of that as we resize barrels. You've got to be careful with that too. You don't want to kind of overcook the whiskey. But also the age of these barrels and the fact that we go through that rebuilding the process, basically ripped apart and then rebuilt again, means that we're getting only the highest grade barrels kind of make it to the distillery, and it means that we've got a quality product at the end. In terms of the Solera process, you know, the thing that I love about Australian whiskey is the diversity, but the thing that I hate about Australian whiskey is that, apart from ours, is that, there is a huge degree of variability from batch to batch. They're all well crafted. They're amazing products. But up until recently, pretty much after we started going down this road, there was a lot of variability from batch to batch by design. So whether it was single barrel or calling out a batch number, the distillers were intent on kind of celebrating different aspects of the barrel and the bond store or rickhouse, and just kind of bringing them to life as a means of, you know, effectively people walking out of the tasting room with 3 bottles instead of 1, right? What the Solera system provides Starward is a really consistent product from batch to batch. It means that, you know, we never empty that Solera vat more than 70%. So it's one big tank. It's like a bottomless cup of coffee. When it gets down to 70%, we top it back up again. And then we just kind of do another batch of whiskey, and then we top it back up again. So, you know, 70% of the batch that we have at the moment is exactly the same as the previous release, and so on and so forth going back, which means that, it might be a teardrop worth, but, in every bottle that we sell, you've still got barrel one that we emptied from the bond store in that glass. And so it's a very, very consistent and, integrated whiskey for that reason.
Right. So since starting your own distillery, which is pretty damn awesome, I mean, it's kind of a twofold question. Me and my, Del Vernell, who's the co-founder of all this, we talk about often, what's it like being the owner, the head distiller, and being going at it for the last several years that you've been going. Is there anything that you would have done different?
Yeah, I guess it's a tough question. Of course, you learn so much, right? I mean, we've been doing this now. I started this with my wife 13 years ago, and so of course you learn lessons along the way. And if you kind of had your time again, maybe you do it differently. But then again, we're in a pretty good spot right now, and that's partly because we've made those mistakes, right? So you can't just erase all the bad bits and say, I'll just follow the good bits, because they inform the decisions you make as much as the good things that you do. But I think every distiller wishes they'd made more. I was hoping to be here 2 years ago, but we kept on running out of stock in Australia. And you always underestimate just how long it's going to take and how much money it's going to take to do it. So, the rough rule of thumb is, take your budget, add 10% and then double it. And that's probably about right. That's kind of where where we've ended up in terms of to get to where we are today. But you can't look backwards and have regrets like that, because they've helped you get to where you are as well.
Okay, cool. So that's basically all I got. I want to get into these drams over here.
Yeah, sure.
I want you to walk me through each of one of them. I've had 2 of them poured.
Great.
For, probably about 15, 20 minutes, letting them open up. But one thing I love is bottle art. I think art's a wonderful thing. And, you have limited space. And of course, space being Starward forward. What's kind of the theme between your 2 gorgeous labels? I absolutely love your bottles.
So, it's interesting, right? Like, coming back to this idea of a modern whiskey from Australia, like, how are we going to do all of this hard work without us hand selling every single bottle on the shelf? And so packaging helps, obviously, cynical people can kind of feel like sometimes packaging is compensating. We kind of looked at it in a way of saying, well, no, we want a gorgeous bottle that befits the gorgeous whiskey that's inside the bottle, right? And whiskey brands from around the world typically take a person, place, or animal as their kind of maker's mark. Jim Beam, Jack Daniels, Johnny Walker, Buffalo Trace, Wild Turkey, and the Glens of all the places, right? So we were kind of tempted to go down a person, place, or animal route, but we felt like that was a pretty well trodden path, and what we wanted to do was think about a way of saying, hey, yeah, this is done differently. This is a whiskey done differently, and so we figured that we'd call out the ambition for the brand, which is to reach for the stars and put that on the bottle. And so, with that in mind, and let's face it, who kind of hates a star? Like, there are things you might go, well, buffaloes are this or that or whatever, but I don't like whatever. But, a name. But, when it comes to stars, I think we can all agree that that's something we can all be inspired by. And so, the world of Starward is kind of wrapped around the bottle. And, on the label, we've got like these constellations of stars, and each of them kind of represent a different variant of whiskey. So we can just basically reorient the label to one of those stars, and then that becomes that particular label. So that's exciting, to be able to do that. And look, we just wanted a well-crafted whiskey, and we wanted to make sure that people understood that it was based on the packaging that was created.
packaging, I kind of think about Christmas time. I bought my wife a kick-ass gift. I'm putting a beautiful kick-ass bow on it because hey, it's going to be something nice in there. Just like I'm anticipating getting my first real sip of Australian whiskey. So I want to start with the Starward Nova.
Okay,
The
good.
single malt finished in the red wine barrel, of course.
Yeah, yeah. So this is and the point is that there are a lot of light wine finishes in the market. I mean, even in bourbon, right? We've got Angel's Envy that kind of have mastered that process of finishing. This is a full maturation. It's full aging in red wine barrels, almost a start. If that's a finish, this is a start. And so when you kind of put the whiskey to your nose, I mean, well, let's start with the color, right? There's a lovely red hue that comes from the wine.
The color is actually beautiful. I have sunshine and over here. That's why I'm so glad I had to get away from the sunshine.
Yeah, it's helping give some beautiful color to the whiskey. I'm going to say,
bottles, it's gorgeous for being young. It's really rich.
Yeah, and so what's going on there? First, we've got it's a single malt whiskey with Nova. We're using brewing barley and fermenting with an ale yeast, and we're not Robinson Crusoe with that. I'm in the Pacific Northwest at the moment. You've got Westland that are doing that. We've got Westward that are doing that, and so we've got lots of kindred spirits around the world taking this idea of, hey, let's brew and ferment like a beer, but distill it like a scotch, effectively, right? And so that's kind of the approach we've taken to the spirit itself. And there's a lot of fruit in our spirit from fermentation, a bit of banana and orchard characteristics coming through. But the overwhelming fruitiness of this whiskey comes from the barrels. And that's because, as I said earlier, we have this wine out, whiskey in approach, right? In the afternoon, the winemaker will be emptying barrels and they'll be overnighted to the distillery, and then we're filling them the next day. Give them a light steam.
Less than 24 hours, you're putting your white dog into the used wine barrels.
That's right. And they haven't been charred or toasted or anything like that. It's really very minimal intervention. And so the benefit of that is that you're getting all of that fruitiness from the wine as well, right? Berry characteristics, strawberries, raspberries, those dark red berries. And then you've got that oak characteristic coming through too. So, winemakers spend a lot of money, thousands of dollars sometimes on wine barrels. But they're aging wine, they're resting wine in these barrels for 2 or 3, maybe 9 months, 2 or 3 times. But wine's at 15% ABV, like 30 proof. So when we put our spirit in at 100 proof, it's effectively a brand new barrel, and we're just drawing out more of these flavors. But what the winemaker has done for us is taken the edges off. A lot of that astringent, oaky character's gone into the wine, because that's what they want, right? So it can cellar for a period of time. And we're left with these beautiful toasty oak characteristics and that, infusion of wine into the wood. And so on the palate, then, it's just an extension of what we just talked about. Real fruit, single malt whiskey. It's going to be mouth coating, luscious. And, you mentioned the word before, rich and bold, right? Like it's got some boldness to it, but it's relatively smooth. For a 3 to 4 year old whiskey, it doesn't behave that way, right?
It doesn't have that, as you said, a 3 to 4 year old whiskey. It does not have that young taste to it. And you're right, the nose is absolutely gorgeous on this one. The red wine just bursts through the sweetness, the fruitiness of it really shines through in the nose. You don't quite get all that on the taste. It's just super subtle and it's very nice. Robert Diane of Whiskey Network, he did a review on both of these. So if he wants to chime in, because he wrote up 2 reviews.
Yeah, between the two of us, Chad, I don't think anyone's going to get a word in sideways. So they just need to wave them down or something.
No,
Robert,
it was,
turn my back.
Yeah, it was funny when I was talking to Chad originally about these. I was like, yeah, they're young, but one of the things I focused on was the finish. for a really young whiskey, I was like, this finish with the red wine barrel is fantastic. It's just, there's that tart fruit, some orchard peach type of thing, but it's nice and rich, which is so surprising. Because when it's that young, you don't get that richness normally.
Right.
And I think there's a couple of tricks to this, right? The first is, quality and quality out, of course. So we're using a brewing barley, which is a bit more textural in the spirit, like just it's an oilier spirit texturally. We're really tight on our still cuts to make sure that we're only getting the heart of the heart, and then there's a couple of other tricks in the barrel itself, right? So we go in at a lower proof point on the single malt whiskies. It's 110. So 110 is quite low for a single malt. Typically they're upwards of 160 or so. And we go in, I should say 63 and a half, so it's 135. But we're adding more water at the beginning of the process so that it's far more integrated at the end. It's more expensive because we're putting water in barrels instead of whiskey in barrels, but it makes for a better whiskey at the end result. And the other thing is that a lot of that texture and length is actually
Did we lose you, Dave?
Yes, we did.
Yes.
We just lost David for a minute. To go back to the Nova, I'm not the biggest finished whiskey person. I do like finished single malts, which obviously this is, but this just drinks really delightful. So Dave will be coming back with us in a few minutes, hopefully.
Yeah,
Looks
he's
like
coming
joining.
back.
So, but anyway, yeah, this has been absolutely informative. What do you guys think? I mean,
I get a little bit of an Irish whiskey kick from it.
it's kind of where I was at with it.
I'm back, guys. Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
Well, that's all right.
That
Stuff
happens.
But we were just kind of talking about the Nova. Tyler kind of gets a little bit of Irish whiskey, and I could totally see that. Myself, I'm just really, God damn, where's Australia been at all my life?
Right. What I really like about this too is, and I didn't know the price before I did the review, found out after I'd taken down my notes, and I was like, wait, this is a $40 whiskey? Right. And I'm actually a big fan of craft whiskey. So I don't have a problem if they're charging like $55, $60 for a quality product. But I was really surprised at the price for both of these, because I was just like, a lot of people here in the States, they're charging easily $15, $20 more for the same whiskey, which makes this really, really approachable.
And Tyler and I were talking the other day on a video conference him and I had, and we tried these. I didn't want to come into this interview not trying it. So I did have a little taste of each one. And let's go over to the twofold, because this is a barley and wheat, malted barley and wheat double grain whiskey. And this one actually really intrigued me the most.
Okay. So, Chad, you and I have, a love affair with Maker's Mark. And this is the love child of Australian whiskey and a wheated whiskey, basically, from the US. Right? In that
whiskey fan, Makers. I've gotten away from Makers for a long time, but some of the Pappy, well, all the Pappies are wheated except for the rye, obviously. Old Weller Antique, I think for $35 a bottle, it's a great bang for your buck if you can find it.
If you can find it, yeah.
And
so and we know what wheated whiskeys do, right? They're rounder, There's a bit more spice to this, but in a good way. A bit more, I find baking spices come through a bit more. It's silkier, but it's still got that signature Starward style of having, because we're aging in wine barrels, you get that other layer of complexity and depth coming through. And, just to finish off what I was saying earlier to Rob, that length is actually the wine carrying a lot of the length as well, right? Yeah. So again, really, lots of complexity. You can sit on these whiskeys, 3 fingers deep, watch a couple of episodes of Netflix and get to know them, and they just kind of continue to reveal themselves to you the more you drink them. And that's always something to me that I love doing with my collection of whiskeys at home. And you know what? It's funny in Australia, a lot of people kind of feel like, oh, well, this is the entry level whiskey and Nova's the superior whiskey. I don't see them that way. I mean, they're my kids, of course. I'm going to treat them equally and love them the same, depending on the day of the week. But the point that I want to make is like, well, there's just some decisions in terms of style as opposed to substance, right. And the magic is that, I think that wheated whiskies do provide a really great entry point into the world of whiskey because they are just a little softer and rounder. And you certainly get that from Twofold. But because
did you say that it was a 60-40 split? Yeah,
so 60% wheat, 40% malted barley, and full aging in the same barrels that you get from Nova. And just on the barrels, we don't typically reuse our barrels, so they're a single use. We are filling some again, we're refilling some, but that's more for light and shade in the blending process, when we're making a batch, than it is about having more spirit forward characteristics coming through. So Twofold for me, is just, I get excited by it. I got excited when we first started prototyping this, and we really doubled down on production. The 60% wheat is separately distilled and matured from the 40% malted barley. And it gives us then flexibility to dial that in. But, we haven't had the need to really. It was always built around 60-40, which now means we've got, like a huge quantity of it available, which is very, very exciting. And that bet is paying off in terms of, as you pointed out, Rob, the price point. So, typically this is sort of sitting around the $30 US price point, which is, for a world whiskey that has these sorts of credentials is, pretty good.
Very affordable.
Yeah, your price points are crazy good. $30 to $40 for a bottle of really good quality whiskey. Single malts, the 2 grain. I mean, it's absolutely stellar. To throw some space stuff in there. So walk me through the Twofold.
Yeah. So again, on the nose, it's going to be, I find this a bit more strawberry and cream characteristic, and you're going to get a bit more of the cereal note coming through from the wheat, right? So it's a bit more biscuity and has that cereal characteristic coming through. I'm going to put it.
Strawberry jam.
Yeah. The traditional jam, those preserves, right? Yeah. Coming through. This is typically if we're have people at the distillery coming along to a tour as a +1, I don't like whiskey, I'm here for him or her, more often than not, they're the one walking out the door with this whiskey. It's a great gateway whiskey into the world of whiskey. And because it just has that approachable, inviting characteristics of familiar flavors that you have that aren't necessarily whiskey flavors. They're home flavors, they're kitchen flavors, right? And so between that strawberry, the biscuity notes, and then there's some toasted sort of oak characteristics, which kind of manifest in, I guess, baking spices, that's the kind of, that's the wheelhouse of this whiskey. Then on the palate, I feel like with with Nova, if you think of a dinosaur, it's a Stegosaurus, right? It does have these sorts of waves of flavor coming through, and a really long finish. With Twofold, it's a bit smoother. It's more of a Brontosaurus, right? Like the wheat is actually filling in all of those gaps and equalizing the flavor that's really integrated.
A little kind of 70s funk going on that's just so cool and smooth. I totally dig this one. I really do. This one really, when I had my first little, like literally about this much in the bottom of the Glen, I took a little nip of it and got that big smile. Like, this is kind of cool. I something about this is really speaks to me. These are really cool whiskeys, man. I honestly think Australia has a spot on the world whiskey market and in the whiskey market in a whole.
Yeah, well, that was the ambition. Thank you. I mean, it was one of those things when you start, you're kind of wondering why you're doing this, for lots of reasons, particularly when, as we discussed, things aren't necessarily going well. And the thing that keeps you going through those tough moments is the idea that maybe, just maybe, we can have a spot on the shelf around the world alongside great American and North American, Canadian whiskey. We forgot to mention those before, but a great American whiskeys, great European whiskeys, Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, Japanese whiskeys, and why not Australian whiskey? And it always
definitely has its spot on the globe. It has a spot on my bar for now on. I guarantee you that.
Oh, thanks, Chad. Really appreciate that.
What is your distribution rate through the U.S. as of right now?
So, is it interesting? There's like, we've got about 35 states that where we can actually have where you can have Starward shipped, and as of, I'm going to say, in 2 weeks' time, by mid-June at the latest, so in time for Father's Day, we're going to have our website be able to fulfill orders through your local retailers as well. So that's going to be pretty exciting.
Website address.
So it's just starward.com.au. So don't forget the AU. And you'll be able to go onto the website and purchase a bottle within about 2 weeks. So that's really exciting. But, we've got people on the ground in Northern and Southern California, the Washington State, Texas, Florida, Arizona. I always miss a few: Nevada, Colorado, Illinois, and pretty much all of the Northeast. Yeah.
So, is that just for the Twofold and the Nova, or
Twofold and Nova are kind of the main products? Solera is going to be a limited release thing that comes and goes.
20 and Solera?
Twofold and Solera, the two whiskeys.
You plan on bringing 20 and Solera? Oh.
Yeah, so Solera is, I think we've got some on the water actually at the moment, so I'll let you guys know when it lands. And then we'll have other whiskeys kind of, other fortified Australian wine barrels kind of come and go when we can get them. They're really hard to find. And then some other limited releases, like I want to take 100, I love Rittenhouse Rye. And so, great whiskey, right? So I want to...
Rittenhouse Rye from 1935. That was
right?
Years. It was absolutely stunning.
I
could write a book about how awesome that glass was.
So, but we've got a 100 proof whiskey coming, just can't quite call it bottled in bond, but we're definitely 100 proof whiskey on its way.
That would be nice.
And
that's actually was one of the questions I wanted to ask, because most of your stuff is a little on the lower proof.
Yeah.
And I'm primarily a bourbon drinker, and
yep.
I'm a bottle and bond guy. I absolutely love the bibs and barrel proof. My God, barrel proof is something chuggable. I was just curious if you plan on up and the ante on the proof.
Yeah, we definitely are. So we're bringing the 100 proof to market because we just figured that that's something that the project name was called Supernova, but if you're a fan of Ardbeg, you know that that's already taken. So I think we've got a better reason to have Supernova, but that's another story for another day.
You changed the spelling around something.
Yeah, with an A maybe. Anyway, so we're going to bring that barrel, sorry, the 100 proof out, and I'm fingers crossed we'll have some before the end of the year, which will be really exciting. And
Awesome.
then we're looking at single barrels. You know, I think that's something that, you know, to your point, gives us the opportunity to have that at, you know, barrel proof whiskey that we can kind of then also say, hey, you know what, this is an American oak Shiraz barrel. Here's a French oak Cabernet barrel. Here's 2 French oak barrels from the same winery, you know, but different vintages.
Right.
And really start to unpick this idea that the wood policy of the winemaker, in our instance, has a profound impact on the flavor the flavor in the distillery. And that Nova is almost like those champagnes, you know, the cru, you know, that they kind of pick certain vintages from different years to make the sparkling wine, the champagne. You know, that's what Nova is. It's a little bit of American oak Shiraz, a little bit of French oak Cabernet, all kind of married together into the one thing where the sum of the parts is way better than any individual one. But, you know, let's take those single barrels for a walk, because, you know, we're all different and our flavor palettes are different. So there might be one that you kind of fall in love with, and let's do that. So single barrels are coming too.
That's awesome, man.
Excellent.
So another question I got for you. We're all whiskey guys in here, you know.
Okay.
The men and women of whiskey are, you know, I'd like to think we're some of the more interesting people. I've met some fantastic people, and one thing I always love to know: what got you into whiskey? What you know, instead of doing the shots or whatever.
No, you know what? This is really so family of origin. I've come from an Italian background, so wine was our, you know, like the drink of choice at home, and the stuff I used to sneak a swig of and was wine and vermouth. That was our world at home, coming in from an Italian family. So it certainly wasn't family of origin. And growing up, you know, the craft beer movement in Australia is about 15 years behind America. So like in the early 90s, like actually it's more towards the late 90s, craft beer started to really flourish. And I fell in love with beer. So actually beer brought me here. Here you go. I'm going to trademark that. But the idea that, you know, we could effectively do to whiskey what craft beer had done to beer was the driving force. And that, you know, we all know that good beer doesn't really travel all that well, and that whiskey is just basically a beer all grown up. So that was kind of the path that got me to Starward. I made way more homebrew than I could ever drink myself. So yeah.
Beside your own distillate, you come home from you got some BS news at work, and you're this, that, and the other. What are your pours? What are your pours?
So I'll tell you what we always have at home. There you go. Right. So and I'll also inform you that our middle daughter's name is Isla. So it gives you an idea of like where we might be going with this conversation.
I'm not that happy, Ed.
I'm a big fan.
So, you know, if I've had a really crappy day and like I need a whiskey to kind of reflect my mood in that way, it's probably going to be a Lefroy 10-year-old cask strength or a Kalila cask strength. I love those two whiskeys. And you know, as much as Wild Turkey is an inspiration for its approachability and roundness and all the things that you can see in twofold, those peated whiskeys are also an inspiration for me, because you pop the cork on a peated whiskey, you know what you're drinking, right? And so you can't out Lefroy in that way, but what you can do is be as distinctive a flavor profile as Lefroy is to Scotch. And that's what we wanted with Starward, is that you put your nose to it and you know you're drinking Australian whiskey and probably Starward, right? And that was kind of the thing that we were shooting for. Rare breed, always at home. Wild turkey rare breed, always at home. I'm like, as we discussed, Rittenhouse rye and Sazerac rye for that matter. You know, big. I love flavor, right? You can kind of see that, and so those are the channels I go down. In the single malt whiskey world, you know, the Balvenie was my first. It was my gateway single malt, the first one I remember anyway, and you know, I hold that in high regard, probably sentimentally as well. You know, like it's because of that. But I mean, David Stewart kind of mastered this idea of barrel finishing, right? And so that was also an inspiration for us. We took it one step further and started the process in wine barrels. But you know, they're always at home. And do you know what? Like, I'm not afraid to say it. We've always got Johnny Walker Black at home. I think for the price point and what you're getting, it's great value for money. And also, you know, over the years, I've been fortunate enough to be able to taste some Johnny Walker Black from the 60s, no, the 40s, 60s, 90s, and today, you know, like, and you can thread a needle through that whiskey over that period of time, right? And so that's how consistent it is. And so coming back to these threads that we talked about before, that's also an inspiration for me because, you know, I think that you've got to deliver on your promise, and you only get one shot with a drinker. And if you let them down, they're not coming back. And we want to make sure that we follow through and deliver that consistent whiskey every time.
So I have to say, this has been a absolute blast for me, Dave. Starward Whisky is so new to me, and I love finding new things. It kind of makes me like, you know, to run down the stairs Christmas time, hopefully find that new bike. And that's what I found over here, man. I want to raise a glass of your twofold to you.
Oh, thank you. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to share with you. And you walked me through the couple of glasses, and you know, so you're welcome back anytime. I look forward to seeing your future endeavors, because I think we're going to see some really kick-ass stuff from you.
Yeah, no problems. I'll be back. We'll bring some of that 100 proof and maybe a single barrel or two along, and we can have a chat about those.
Oh yeah. I'll tell you what, anytime you find yourself on the East Coast, man, we'll throw a fire up in the backyard. We'll light up the barbecue. We'll crack a couple bottles and toast each other, and just toast whiskey and the world of whiskey, because it's a beautiful freaking world, isn't it?
It sure is. Yeah.
Cheers, mate.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Have a great night.
Cheers, Dave.